Hi everyone, it's Mary from Joyful and Mary Quilting, and today I want to show you a project that is really simple to make, but you know what? It's incredibly meaningful. It's called a Quilted Hug Shawl, and just as the name suggests, it's meant to feel like a warm hug wrapped around someone's shoulders. Now the finished size of this shawl is 68 by 32.5 inches or so, and it's designed especially for someone who's seated, such as someone in a wheelchair, or maybe someone who spends a lot of time sitting. The project was originally created by Carrie Brooks of Olathe, Kansas as a pay-it-forward idea, encouraging people to make these shawls and gift them to someone who could use a little extra warmth and comfort. I love the idea because quilting has always been about caring for others in one way or another. I made this one here for a friend of mine who uses a wheelchair. Now, a traditional quilt, when you wrap it around your shoulders, it can slip off the shoulders, but this design stays in place and then it closes in the front with Velcro. So today I'm going to walk you through how to make your own quilted hug shawl from start to finish. Before we begin sewing, let's talk about fabric. Now, the shawl can be made in a few different ways. You can use a single piece of fabric, piece it with fabric strips, or you can even use quilt blocks if you want for the front of the shawl. The inside, it doesn't matter, it's just a straight piece of fabric. Now, I use strips because I just liked it. I think it gives the shawl a little visual interest. I've got larger strips and smaller strips, but it's up to you, whatever you want to do. But keep in mind that even though the shawl is pieced as a long rectangle, once you fold the rectangle, you'll fold the ends down in the front. So the direction of your strips are going to change. So if you're thinking about using strips or blocks or whatever, think about how they will look when the shawl is worn and then position them that way. Now for this sample behind me, I used cotton fabric on the front, 100% cotton on the back, and a light batting. Some people make these using fleece, but I prefer the 2 layers of quilting cotton plus light batting just because I think it feels really nice and really comfy, but it is totally your choice. Now let's talk about the supplies for this project. Today I'm showing you this particular pattern made with 3 fabrics. So first of all, you'll need to download the pattern, joyfulandmaryquilting.com/hug. Once you've got that, it has all the requirements in here plus the instructions. Then for fabrics, I chose 3 different fabrics. Now I have a light fabric, that's this one, and you'll need 2 yards of that. I call it a medium fabric, but you know, it's 3 contrasting fabrics. This one is a pink, and you will need 4.5 yards of this. I used this fabric not only for the strips on the front, but I also used it for the backing, so 4.5 yards. Then another 3rd fabric, you'll also need 2 yards of that. In addition to the fabrics you'll need a 7.5 inch piece of 1 inch wide Velcro or similar hook and loop fastening tape, whatever works for you. 7.5 is just approximate. You'll measure that when you get to that point. You'll need your batting cut to the size needed for your particular quilting method. Now, as a general rule, I cut the batting the same size as the backing fabric, and I cut the backing fabric slightly larger than the quilt or the shawl top. So for this project, I used a 2 yard by width of fabric piece. Now, all of the strips used in this version of the shawl, this version, are cut 72 inches long. Keep in mind, there's an option in the pattern to use with the fabric strips as well. You can sew them together in pairs and then trim each of those to 72 inches. A little extra work. You save a little fabric on that, but not a whole lot. I won't be covering that in the demo, but cutting instructions are in the handout. Now, we have a few more tools that we're going to be using here. First of all, you'll probably need some clips. The clips work well because we're using some thick layers and the clips hold it better, a little easier to use than pins. You will also need, of course, your rotary cutter. I like to use a marking pen when I mark in the seam allowance any of my cutting marks. I have this one. You can use a pencil, you can use disappearing ink, water soluble, whatever you want. You're going to be marking in the seam allowance, so it should not show. But if you're worried about that, use something that will disappear. Some pins, because there are occasions that we will be pinning. I used a tape measure because there are some really long cuts that we're going to be making in order to get the rectangle, and the tape measure just worked better than a ruler. It was longer. I didn't have a ruler that was long enough to take care of that. So a tape measure works well. Then a straight edge of some sort when you actually do the cutting or when you do the measuring. I have also used tape instead of the marking pen. You can take the tape and just lay it along the edges where you want to cut and then cut with scissors. That works as well. Now let's talk about cutting the strips from our fabric. Remember, we have the light piece of fabric here, and the instructions are in the handout as to how many pieces. The light piece is the only one that we're going to cut a larger piece, a 6.5 inch by 72 inch piece. So we actually just have one of those. The rest will be cut 2.5 inch strips. We've got my light, my two contrasting fabrics. Just check in the pattern and it will tell you exactly how to cut those. I have my backing fabric here. That's my 2-yard piece. And then for the closure, you'll need 2 rectangles, 3 inches by 8 inches of fabric. So be sure and cut those as well. So here are the cutting instructions. The lengthwise grain cutting, which is what I did, so there's no seam in the back. If you prefer the crosswise grain cutting, make sure that you press your seams in opposite directions so that they nest together and you have a straight seam in the back that's right in the center. So when you do trim your strips to 72 inches, because they'll be about 80 inches, you'll want to cut off the same amount on each side. I would sew the strips together first, make sure that they're all nested, and then do the trimming at the end, but that's just me. Let's go to page 4 of our handout, and this is the directions for assembly. So keep in mind now, when you are sewing your strips together, and you can see that on page 4, figure 1, you're going to sew the first strip to the second one. The first one's going to be sewn to the larger 6.5 inch strip. And then you will sew the third strip beginning at the opposite end. That is really important. You'll sew this direction, the fourth strip you'll sew this direction, the fifth one you'll sew this direction. The reason we sew in alternating directions is because for some reason, if you start at one end and sew all the way to the opposite end and start each strip at the same end, they start to bow. I don't know why that happens. I'm sure there's a scientific reason behind it. But we don't want that because it looks terrible. It looks crooked. So when you sew in alternating directions, especially when it's these long strips, it works best to sew them in alternating directions. So here's a good method that you can use. Rather than sewing one strip, one strip, one strip, you can sew them in pairs. Pair them together, then sew the pairs together, then sew those 4 strips together, and so on until you have that top completed. You can still alternate the directions when you're sewing, but it is really helpful then to keep that straight and aligned, and then you're able to fit a lot more under your sewing machine. Sometimes it gets a little rough as you're going along to continually add one strip, one strip, one strip. When you're sewing in pairs, it just makes it a little easier. So when you are finished putting all those strips together, you're going to have a rectangle that measures 72 inches, maybe a little jagged on the edge, by 32 inches, or 32.5 inches is what it should measure from top to bottom. Once again, if it's not exactly 32.5, it's okay. If it's a little jagged, it's okay. Your shawl rectangle may be a bit misshapen, as I said, but after you sew all the strips together and trim them up, it'll be perfect. We'll square it up first before we quilt it, and then once we quilt it, we're going to trim it to that 68 inches. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to quilt the rectangle, and I'm going to show that to you. At this point, the quilt top, the batting, and the backing are layered together, just like you would for any quilt. Now, you can quilt it on a long arm, you can quilt it on a domestic machine, you can do straight line quilting on your sewing machine, however you want to do it. Free motion quilting, totally up to you. You just want to get that quilt top quilting. So let's take a look at the shawl here. This is basically just a rectangle that we've cut the corners off. We've put the closure in the front, and then we folded the top back just to make it snug around the neck. What we have here is the Velcro closure that makes it really easy to put it back together again or undo it, especially if you don't have good movement with your hands. Now, if you take a look at this, so you can see this is the back, here's the closure. Let's turn it around and take a look at the front. We've got the pockets in each corner. Now, if we turn it around, Here's the rectangle where we've sewn all the strips together. This is the larger strip. That's at the top because I want that to show in the front. And then my closure, and then the rectangle has the corners cut off and it's bound. So let me put it on. It just goes over your shoulders. And then you can see the top folds back. So we've got a little bit of a collar. And then we just put it together. And then what we do, you can put your hands inside the pockets and it can kind of snugly hold you close if you want, or just if your hands are cold, you've got it there, but you have easy movement, you can take it out, and it's open at the neck just in case anybody needs access when it comes to ports or anything like that if they're going through some type of therapy. So here we go. This is what we're going to be making. It's super easy to make, as you can see. Some of it's a little bit tricky, so I'll go through those steps with you. Okay, so this is where we are at this point. We've sewn all of our strips together, as you can see. The top strips here are the 2.5, 6.5, and 2.5, followed by alternating strips. You can use anything you want, any fabrics you want, it doesn't matter. What matters is that we have this 72-inch wide by 32.5, 33, whatever it ends up being in length. That's the important part. And now we are going to talk about trimming it up into the shawl rectangle. This one has been quilted already, so I have my backing, I have my batting, and I have quilted it into the rectangle. I also trimmed it up once it was quilted so that now it's 68 inches wide. So I'm all set with that part. It's shawl rectangle at this point and it's ready to be cut. Now, in order to get a good even cut, I want you to take a look at your pattern and turn to page 5. There's a really good diagram on page 5 that gives you the exact measurements as to how you want to cut those corners off. This is a huge rectangle, so that's what makes it a little challenging. So the instructions that I give you, I show you that what you're going to need to do is you're going to measure 6.5 inches from the top left corner down on the left side. I put a piece of tape on here just because it was really hard to see the marking in the video. But all you need to do is just use your marker, your pencil, whatever you have, and make a little mark right there at the 6.5 inch from this top corner down. This side, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to mark from the top right corner 6.5 inches. I've got a mark right there. That's where my 6.5 inches. Okay, so that's the first 2 points you're going to do. The next 2 points you're going to do, fold your shawl rectangle in half so that you find the center point. You just have to fold it. You don't need to do any measuring or anything like that. Just fold it in half. Put a pin in it where that center is. Now I've got a piece of tape here and I have marked that tape with a dash that would be in my seam allowance. So now this is my midpoint. From the midpoint, take your ruler, any ruler that's got at least 10 inches, and you're going to measure 10 inches from that center point over and make another mark. So 10 inches from the center point and then same on the opposite side. 10 inches from the center point. So now we have, this point doesn't matter anymore. Now we have these 2 points, those will match with the 2 upper points, the 6.5 inch ones. Now this is where that is a big long cut, and unless you have a big long ruler, it's hard to keep that even. So I have one, and this is going to go from here to here. You can take your marker and you could just mark it. It's going to be cut off, so it doesn't matter. You can take your marker and run it alongside the ruler and then cut with your scissors. You can cut with your rotary cutter if you want, if you've got a ruler long enough, or you can just take a piece of tape from corner to corner and make sure it's straight and even and cut alongside that. Totally up to you, whatever works best for you. You want to make it easy on yourself. Once you have cut the corners off, it's time to figure out how big the pockets need to be. And that's on page 6. So I'll show you that once we've made those cuts. Go ahead and make the cuts, and then we'll talk about binding those pockets, cutting them to size. Now I showed you in the handout in the pattern how to cut those corners off the shawl. That's these corners right here. Just by measuring, we measured, remember, 6.5 inches down from the top right and top left corner, made a little mark. Then we measured 10 inches across from the center marking made a little mark, and then you're going to connect those two marks. Now, how do we connect them? I found it easy to fold this in half with the back sides together. I mean, you can do it the other way. You can do it where you just trim one side and then the other. You do need a larger blade if you do this, or a good push if you're using your 45mm blade. The 60mm blade works really well because it's thicker and you do have a lot of layers that you're going through here. So there's a few ways I'll show you how to do it. First of all, what you can do is you can take your tape measure, you can position it at that 6.5 inch marking, and then down to the 10 inch from center marking. Draw a line, because this would not be easy to cut against with a rotary cutter. You would draw a line. You can use any marker, anything you can see, because you're going to cut on it, so it's not going to show. This is just my water-soluble marker. Draw from this point to this point. Then you can cut using your scissors, your 45 with a good push, or your 60mm rotary cutter, whatever you choose. So that's one way that you can do it. Now, the other thing that you can do is you can take your painter's tape, start down at this point, and position it from here to here, and then again use your scissors or your rotary cutter to cut. Now, if you do that, you want to make sure you have it straight, because it's easy for tape to get a little bit crooked. The other thing is, if you do that, you want to make sure this is all pinned together really well here and here, so that it doesn't slip and come apart as you're cutting. So you just want to make sure, if you're folding it in half, that everything is positioned in such a way that it's stuck together pretty well as you're making the cut and it doesn't get off. If that concerns you, go with the other method and just cut one corner at a time. The other thing that you can do, I have a big long ruler that I can lay right along that edge, and I can cut from this point to this point, and that works really well also. A ruler like this is nice because it's got that wider flat side, and it doesn't move as easily as it would if you're using a smaller ruler and you're trying to shimmy it up the side. So I like the big ruler. If you don't have a big ruler, you can carefully position your regular ruler, but that's where the tape comes in handy, because you can keep the tape there and then just slide your ruler up along the tape. The last choice is a yardstick. A yardstick fits nicely along this side as well. Now, keep in mind that a yardstick is a little thick right here. So you want to have a cutter with a blade that's not going to get trapped when you are actually cutting. So that's where the 60 works out well. So now that we have cut these pieces off, don't throw them away, because these are going to be the inside pockets. And what I love about this is they're already quilted. They're already ready to go. All we have to do is cut them to size, and then we are going to put some binding across one of the edges. So let's open this up and see what we have. So there we have the shawl rectangle with those corners removed. The corners are here. We're going to turn them into pockets. As you can see, I've got my marked points. We'll just take that tape off of there. And we are ready to add pockets and then bind them. So let's go ahead and take the shawl down, and I will show you how to measure for the pockets. So here's the back of the shawl. This is the way that we have it positioned, with the inside of the shawl up. And then we are going to take the quilted side, or the front side of our shawl, up and place it in the corner. Now you see we have 8 inches. That's how far over this is going to go. So I've measured 8 inches and I put a pin in it. You can do the same thing with your ruler if you want. But what we want to make sure is that we have everything matched up right. So we've got 8 inches from corner in. And then here we also have 8 inches, and I'm just going to put a little mark on it right here, just to give me a vantage point. Now, I'm going to place this corner right in line with the 8 inches, and then this pin is going to line up right with that corner of the shawl rectangle. And then we are going to, you can pin it or you can clip it in place, whatever works for you. I just want to make sure that it's held in place. Now, I also want to make sure it's held in place down here. This is nice and straight because I've lined it up here, but I want to put a pin in it because I'm going to flip this over and I'm going to cut along that line right here along the edge of the inside of the shawl. So we want to make sure, actually we'll turn it over so the right side is up. but we want to make sure that we've cut accurately, and we don't want to get this pin too close to where we're going to be doing our cutting. So I'm just going to put it here. It's lined up nicely, and then carefully flip it over. I'm going to turn it this direction because this is the way I'm going to cut it. This is what I need to do to cut that pocket out. So line up your ruler. You can use your big ruler, your smaller ruler, whatever works for you. I'm going to use the big ruler because it gives me a little more leverage. And I'm going to line it right up along this edge, and I'm going to cut. Now you can cut all the way off, or you can stop here and then pivot, whatever. I'm just going to cut it off because you will not use this piece. And then we're going to turn it this direction. And we're going to cut this corner off. Line that up, make sure everything is straight. And there we've cut off those pieces. Now let's take a look at the other side. And there we have one of our pockets. Now you'll do the same process on the other side. You're going to mark your 8-inch mark. You're going to put your corner on that spot, and be sure and use your pattern to make sure that you have everything lined up right. Sometimes it can be a little difficult. Now you can see I've got it upside down, so I want to make sure that I've got this looking like this. We've got our piece here. We're going to measure our 8 inches over. Put a little mark. We want to make an 8-inch mark on this piece so that we can line that up. Just needs to be a little one. You don't want it to be, way into the pocket. And then we're going to line up the corner with this mark and this corner with this mark and pin that one in place. Again, we don't want to get too close to where we're going to do our cutting because we don't want to try and cut over a pin. That does not work. And then we want to make sure that we've got this pinned up here just to hold it in place when we flip it over. Okay? I'm going to put one more pin in right here. All right, let's carefully flip it over. And again, you can see right where we need to cut this, just right along that edge. No measuring, just cut. So I'm going to cut up from this corner, align the bottom edge with my line of my ruler, and then cut across. Okay. And now we have our pockets cut. It's so simple, and they are going to go on the inside right where we have them. But before we do that, we have raw edges along here. So we need to put a binding strip here and here. Now, you have cut 3 binding strips. You have cut, remember, we've got an extra long length that we're using. So in order to get all the way around this particular shawl, we have sewn together 2 pieces plus the leftover from a 3rd piece. Now, 2 of the pieces, like I say, are just the straight length that we've cut, and then the 3rd piece, we're going to cut 2 2.5 inch by 18-inch pieces off of it. That's going to be the binding for our pocket. Now I've already folded these in half and pressed them, but you can see we've cut those off, and then there's still going to be a pretty good piece left over that you're going to sew to this. So I'm not going to unwind it all the way. This is my binding, but there are 2 long pieces and then the leftovers from cutting this that have all been sewn together. So you've got 3 seams on this. That's going to be to bind our shawl. But the first thing we want to do is we're going to have to take that pocket off, and we are going to sew the binding to the long edge. The longest edge is going to get the binding. So whatever way you sew your binding on, it's totally up to you. I did leave a little extra on this end and a little extra on this end, just because that way we could just trim it up. So you can use clips, you can use pins, whatever you have. You're going to sew that 1/4 inch, and then you're going to flip this around to the other side and sew it again. I do glue basting on this. I really like that. I have a video on that. If you haven't done that before, you can watch the video and it tells you how to glue baste. So we're going to sew this on. We're going to do that to both pockets, and then we're going to come back and we are going to pin them to the pocket. So go ahead and bind the top part of each one of your pockets. Okay, we have the binding sewn onto the top of our pockets, and we just need to trim those up because they're a little bit oversized. Now remember, these are on the inside of your shawl, but we still want to make sure that they look nice and neat. There's one. Okay, so there we have the 2 pockets ready to be added to the inside of the shawl. So once again, take a look at your pattern because you want to position those the right way. Figure 6 inside of shawl on page 6. So let's open up our shawl, and this is the corner. We're going to do this top corner first. So we'll get the right one. That's going to be this piece. And it just fits right in here because we cut it to size. So this, of course, will be open because this is the pocket, but this is all going to be sewn into the binding. So this is where your clips are really important. You want to make sure that you get everything lined up edge to edge, because if it's not, when you sew the binding on, it's going to sneak out and you're going to see some raw edges. Now, again, you sew the binding on whatever your favorite way is to sew binding. I use 2.5 inch strips. I don't use bias binding because this is going to be washed a lot. We want to make sure that it holds up. And then we will pin the other side as well, or clip the other side as well. We've got this corner. So we've cut this to size, and we're going to clip it once again. This is the open part. This is the part that's going to be sewn to the binding. And our little mark is still there, so we know everything is in the right spot. You want to make sure that the front side, this side, is up, and we're attaching it to the inside of the shawl. And again, you just want to make sure all those raw edges are lined up nicely. And you will need a walking foot when you sew because these are just way too thick to just sew straight. So it's time to add our binding. Again, however you do it. I like to add mine to the front first, and then I flip it around to the back side. But what the important part is here is you want to get your starting point. I'm going to start about here. I take about 6 inches extra. I'm going to start right there, and that's where I'm going to actually pin. That way I know where my binding is starting. And then you're just going to clip all the way around, including the pocket. So that's where I'm going to replace those clips. And you can see, check on the back, make sure everything's caught in there. Go ahead and sew your binding. Now, when you get to these points right here, I'm going to show you how I do it to get around those corners, because these are not square corners like we have here. This would be just like regular binding. This is just a little bit different, so I'm going to show you how to do that one and this one. So let's go ahead and get started on the binding. When we get to that point, I'll show you what to do. We're just going to sew along the edge, 1/4 inch seam, sewing the binding to the front side. The critical part is going to be right here because that's where that point is. So we're not going to clip this yet because we have to do a little pencil marking and then twisting of this binding strip. So let's just sew down the edge. And I like to use a rather large stitch when I do this, like a good 2.5, maybe even more. You could even go as high as a 3 point if you want. 2.5 seems to work pretty well. Now be careful, because right here is where we're starting to catch the pocket. We don't want it to bend under. Okay, so we're getting close. I'm going to move my clip down a little bit. Now what we need to do is take a ruler with a 1/4 inch seam allowance that we can easily see, and we're going to mark a cross point here. So the way I do it is I line up my 1/4 inch seam right along the edge. You can see the edge peeking out. And then I'm going to do the same thing along this side, lining the 1/4 inch marking along that edge. And you can't see it here, but you can tell that it's aligned. And then we're going to draw another line here. So now I've got that little cross point that I will pin right in it, and I am going to sew to the cross point, and then I'm going to sew off. So let's do that. Just be careful when you get close that you go slow. There, I'm right in the cross point. I'm just going to turn it and sew off the edge. Now here's the part that's just a little bit tricky. I'm going to replace those clips there so I make sure that everything stays aligned. So now that we've sewn here, we are going to turn the corner. What we want to make sure is that this edge and this raw edge are both aligned. And that means we're going to have a little bit of a flap here. And that's what we want, because we need to fold it around the edge and we need an extra. Now, if you were doing this on a 90-degree corner, that's different. We know how to do that, and I'll show you that if you don't. But this one is a little persnickety. So we want to make sure, as you can see right here, we've got that lined up. Finger press it a little bit, and then we're going to start before the fold, and we're going to continue sewing a 1/4 inch all the way around. So I've got that lined up, and I'll show you why that's important. Now we're coming to a 90-degree corner, and if you're not familiar with how to do that, that's just like we would do on any quilt corner. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to mark this direction with that 1/4 inch seam allowance marking lined up with the raw edge. And then the same thing in this direction, the 1/4 inch seam allowance marking lined up with this edge, and we're going to make another little cross there. Then I like to put a pin in there just to hold that in place, because once you get down to that corner, this wants to wiggle a little bit. We're going to sew to that point, and then we're going to sew diagonally off the edge. Go slow when you get close, and take out that pin before you get to it. You don't want to run over a pin. And there it is. We're going to turn this diagonally, sew off the end. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have here. We are going to now do another one of those folds like we did here, but this time, again, we always want that raw edge to line up, but here we also want the fold to line up with this edge because it's a 90-degree. We want these folds to line up. So we've got a lot of thinking to do here. We've lined up these folds, we've lined this fold with the raw edge, and we have also aligned this raw edge going in the next direction. So now that it's here, you're going to put this under your foot again and start sewing that 1/4 inch seam. Now, you'll want to make sure that this is all clipped well all along the pocket so that you catch everything in the pocket. And you can see I'm to the edge of the pocket, and then I will just continue going along that edge. Let's just take a look. I'm not going to sew all the way around because I want to show you what that corner looks like. Okay, so let's just stop. You would continue going all the way around the edge. But let's pretend that we're all done, and let's take a look at this corner right here. So here's that corner, and we are going to turn this. When we turn it, We want to make sure that we have that nice corner there. It's going to come around to the other side. So just like any other corner, we are going to be sewing along. We want to miter these corners. Now, this one is going to just fold this way. Some people use a pin where you can hold it here and fold it there and then clip it. Now that's our 90 degree. Continue clipping. If you glue baste, you would be glue basting this now and ironing it rather than putting it under the sewing machine, but I'm just going to show you this. So we're going to, again, sew here. When we get to here, we've got a little bulk. That's where we're going to make that turn. So we'll take our pin and there it meets nicely. Then you're going to put a clip in it to hold it in place. And then you're going to continue around the corner. Now, if you are glue basting this, if that's the way that you attach your binding, this would be glued down underneath and pressed to dry the glue. You would also put a little tiny dab of glue here just to hold that in place as well. But you can see, you just have to do a little bit of finagling to make sure that those pieces line up before you clip. And then you're going to go ahead and sew your binding all the way around just like you would any other quilt top. Now that we have the shawl bound, it's bound all the way around on all the edges, we need to finish up by adding the closure. And if you take a look at your pattern on page 8, it talks about this 3" by 8" closure. You'll take the two pieces, I'm just going to fold this up for a second, the two pieces right sides together, so you have two pieces, and you're going to sew all the way around the edge, leaving an opening. So you'll sew 1/4 inch all the way around the edge and leave the opening, clip the corners up to the stitching line, but not including the stitching line, and turn it right side out. Once you finish that, you've turned it right side out, pressed it and folded in that edge that we left open, you're going to sew 1/8 inch all the way around the edge just to catch that opening. And now we have our closure done. Now I've already finished this part of it just so that I could show you how to do it, but once the closure is finished, you're going to take your Velcro, hook and loop, whatever you call it. You're going to cut a piece about 7 inches or so. You just want it a little bit less than the closure, so whatever size your closure ends up being, you'll cut this just a little bit shorter. This is the fuzzy side. You'll have this side up, and you are going to sew it to one of the edges on the side. They're both the same, so it doesn't make any difference. You're going to sew it to the right side. So we've got that sewn, then set that aside. Now on our shawl, you'll want to make sure that these points are together, and just put a little clip in there just to hold them there. You are going to attach the hook side of your hook and loop to the right side of the shawl, the right side as we're looking at it. Where do we start? We start right where the pocket ends. So you're just going to have to feel it. I can feel the pocket ends right here, so I'm starting my Velcro strip here. I glued it down with a glue stick just to hold it in place, and then you'll sew all the way around the edge. Now that this is sewn down, it's time to finish up by adding that closure. So now that we have this positioned here, we have our Velcro sewn to the side of our closure. We're going to want to make sure that we have positioned this so that it's centered. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And then you're going to pin right along this edge before you take it apart. So it's one pin. Okay, so they're pinned. Take that apart, and then you're going to sew right along this edge to keep that in place. So you can sew a square, you can sew down this side of the binding, you can just sew on one side, you can sew across the top, whatever you want to do. You just want to make sure that this is secured well to this side of the shawl so that when we go ahead and replace that each time and pull it apart, it doesn't come off. And that's it. You're finished with your shawl. And there you have it. We finished our shawl. We have the closure done. It's got the pockets on the inside, and we are ready to gift it to someone. This pattern, the Quilted Hug, was a creation of Carrie Brooks. Thank you, Carrie. We're so excited to be able to do this. I hope you find somebody that you can give a quilted shawl to, that you can make one and pass it along. It's a pay it forward kind of thing. Don't forget to download your free pattern, and you can go ahead and make as many as you like. I know that they will be loved. I'm always trying to be joyful, but I will always be merry. Thank you so much for joining me.